Good morning, everybody. It's Miss Lavoie here. So today, what we will be working on is the Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt. We're going to listen to the audio like how we would in Miss Soper Stevens' class, and then I have notes, that I'm going to stop and pause and do a brief discussion on them like we would do in English. You have your discussion, your questions due Monday, and the journal. So make a note of that. If you want help with those, let me know. I'm going to work on them on Sunday. Well, I'll post a video on Sunday. If you want it sooner, just let me know. So, let's get started. We are reading November. Okay.
November. November dripped onto Long Island as it did every year. The days turned gray and damp, and a hovering mist licked everything. The perfect white cement sidewalk in front of the perfect house was always wet. The azaleas lost the remnants of their white and pink blossoms, and then many of their leaves, and since they were half naked and embarrassed, my father wrapped them in tight burlap, which also got wet. On the first Saturday, I cut the lawn for the last time. And then my father cut the lawn again to get it right, since it was going to look this way until spring, he said, and it had better look good.
Note on that, why do we think his father wanted to mow the lawn after he just mowed the lawn? After Hood just mowed the lawn. I'll give you a second to think. I think because he's a perfectionist, right? The father. We talked about that in class. So I'm making a note like this. Perfectionist dad with lawn. See, do you have to do this? Absolutely not. Could you do this on a separate piece of paper? Sure. But this is just helping us understand. Now we'll keep reading. So Dad wanted to mow the lawn again after his son literally just mowed the lawn because, quote unquote, he wanted it. My father cut the lawn again to get it right since it was going to look this way until spring, he said, and it had better look good. Interesting, right?
The next Saturday, we climbed up to the roof and cleaned out the gutters since they were overflowing now every time it rained and the dirty water was staining the corners of the perfect house, which made my father really mad. But not as mad as the stain on the ceiling of the perfect living room made him. No one knew how long water had been dripping down onto it because no one ever went in there. So by the time my mother discovered it while vacuuming, the stain was as wide as a garbage can lid and dark with mold. That night, when my father reached up to feel it, a handful of plaster came down on his face. Some of the moldy stuff got into his mouth. It was a very quiet supper. But that's November. It's the kind of month where you're grateful for every single glimpse of the sun or any sign of blue sky above the clouds, because you're not sure that they're there anymore. And if you can't have sun or blue sky, then you wish it would snow and cover all the gray world with a sparkling white so bright that your eye can't take it in. But it doesn't snow on Long Island in November. It rains, and rains, and rains. Which is how I think Mrs. Baker got the idea of assigning me the Tempest. But her nefarious plot to bore me to death failed again because the Tempest was even better than the Merchant of Venice. In fact, it almost beat out Treasure Island, which is saying something. It was surprising how much good stuff there was. A storm, attempted murders, witches, wizards, invisible spirits, revolutions, characters drinking until they're dead drunk, an angry monster named Caliban. Can you believe it? I was amazed that Mrs. Baker was letting me read this. It's got to be censored all over the place. I figured that she hadn't read it herself, otherwise she would never have let me at it. Caliban, the monster in the play, not the escaped rat, he knew cuss words. I mean, he really knew cuss words. What Mr. Vendlary said while standing on Danny Hupfer's desk didn't come close. Even Doug Swiatek's brother couldn't cuss like that, and he could cuss the yellow off a school bus. I decided to learn them all by heart, even if I didn't know exactly what they meant. I didn't know what most of Doug Swiatek's brother's cusses meant either, and it didn't make all that much difference. It's all in the delivery anyway. So I practiced in my bedroom, thinking of my sister. A southwest blow on ye and blister you all o'er. I know. It doesn't sound like much, but if you say it slow and menacing, especially when you get to blister, it'll do. Keep your eyes half closed and it will really do. But for the rest of the Caliban curses, it's a lot better to say them loud and fast, like, "The red plague rid you," and "Toads, beetles, bats, light on you," and "As wicked do as ere my mother brushed with raven's feather from unwholesome fen, drop on you." I'm not exactly sure what that last one means, but if you really hit the last 3 words hard, it will do its stuff. I told you that Mrs. Baker wouldn't have let me read this if she'd read it herself. Every night after supper, I'd practice in front of the dresser mirror, without my shirt because I could look more menacing that way. I decided to perfect the toads, beetles, bats one first, since that was the one I understood the best, and because when I said it, a little bit of spit came out with the beetles. By the second Tuesday night, I had gotten it about down and could say toads with a blood-curdling croak when my mother knocked on my bedroom door. "Holling," she said, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," I called. "That sounds like you're talking to someone." "I'm practicing for a speech," I said, which was sort of true. "Oh," she said. "Oh, then I'll leave you to finish." I worked on the red plague for a bit because that one is all in the timing. Then my father knocked on the door. There must have been a commercial on. "I can hear you all the way down in the den. What are you doing?" "Practicing Shakespeare," I said. "What do you need Shakespeare for?" "For Mrs. Baker." "For Mrs. Baker?" "Yes." "Then get it right," he said and walked away. I went back to the toads, beetles, bats until my sister knocked on the door. "Holling?" "Yeah." "Shut up." "A southwest blow on ye and blister you all o'er," I said. She threw open my door. "What did you say to me?" In the face of a 16-year-old sister who is about to drop something on you from heaven, even Shakespeare fails. "Nothing," I said. "Keep it that way," she said. "And put your shirt on, you weirdo." She slammed the door shut. I decided I was done with practicing for the night.
Okay, so that was one. All right. Here are some notes that I took down. So we talked about the perfectionist on page 49, Dad, with the lawn, and how Holling keeps using the word perfect to describe his house, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then I said on page 50, does Mrs. Baker actually want him to be bored to death? Do you really think that's why she gave him the book? And then on page 51, I said, do we think Mrs. Baker really didn't read the play before giving it to him? Fun fact, teachers 100% of the time will go over the work before they give it to a student. So, from his perspective, he thinks that Mrs. Baker's still plotting against him, what I think. But you can think something different if you would like. And then on page 52, I made a note that where it says, what do you need Shakespeare for Mrs. Baker? For Mrs. Baker? Yes, then get it right. I'm thinking that Dad still is thinking highly of Miss Baker. But let's keep reading. So now we're going on to 2, so that's right over here.
I went to school early the next day since I needed some private place to practice the curses. When I reached the 3rd floor, I found Mr. Vendlary holding a ladder steady in the middle of the hall. He had half a dozen spring traps in his hand, which he was holding up toward Mr. Guareschi. I could see only Mr. Guareschi's legs, since the rest of him was poked up through an opening where he'd removed some asbestos tiles. "Hand me the rest," Mr. Guareschi called down, and Mr. Van Larry did. "Now the cheese." Mr. Van Larry reached into his bib overalls and pulled out a plastic bag with cubes of yellow cheese. "Now I'll just pull this spring back," Mr. Guareschi said, "and set the bait right beneath." There was a sudden loud snap. And then it wasn't Mercy dropping down as the gentle rain on the place beneath. It was Mr. Guareschi. "Oh!" he said. Not really oh, but it wasn't as good as Shakespeare. Not even as good as Mrs. Baker. Mr. Guareschi looked up from the floor. His face was red and his fingers redder. He shook them wildly, as if he wanted them to separate from the rest of him. "Oh," he said again. Not really. "You could try the Red Plague rid you," I said. Mr. Guareschi, still on the ground, looked up at me. "What are you doing in school so early?" he said. "Or scurvy patch," I said. Mr. Guareschi shook his fingers again. "You're not supposed to be here this early," he said. "He saw us putting up the cages," said Mr. Van Larry. Mr. Guareschi stared at him. "This is the student who let the rats go," he said. "He already knows." Mr. Van Larry looked hard at me. Then he put his finger up to his lips. "Not a word," he said. "Toads, beetles, bats, light on me if I let it out," I said, and I got the timing just right, even a little bit of spit on the beetles. Mr. Guareschi looked at me strangely, and then he slowly stood, picked up the spring traps that had fallen around him, and turned to climb back up the ladder. Considering the condition of his red fingers, I thought it was pretty brave of him. "Go to class, Hollinghood," he said. Mrs. Baker was already in her classroom. She was looking up at the ceiling when I came in, listening to the scrambling and pattering of feet scurrying across the asbestos tiles overhead. We listened together for a moment until the scurrying stopped. "Not a word, Mr. Hoodhood," she said. "Not a word," I said, and went to my desk. "Did you finish The Tempest?" asked Mrs. Baker. "Yes," I said. "We'll see this afternoon," she said, and she turned back to a pile of essays on her desk, spreading a red plague over them with her pen. Even though I didn't have the private place to practice that I wanted, I figured I could work on the Caliban curses to see if I could get them down just right in a pressure situation. So I whispered into my desk, "Strange stuff. The dropsy drown you," which was cheating a little because I put two together. But I thought it sounded right. I tried it again, thinking about Caliban and Sycorax, the rats, not the monsters in the play, because I wanted to make the strange stuff come out more like a hiss. "Strange stuff. The dropsy drown you," I whispered. "Is there something you have to say?" asked Mrs. Baker. I sat up. "No," I said. "Are you speaking to someone hiding in your desk?" I shook my head. She put a red pen down. "Since there are only two of us in the room, a situation which has become very familiar to us these past months, and since you were speaking, I assumed that you must be addressing me. What did you say?" "Nothing." "Mr. Hoodhood, what did you say?" "Strange stuff that dropsy drown you." Mrs. Baker considered me for a moment. "Was that what you said?" "Yes." A curious line to recite, especially since the combination never occurs in the play. Are you trying to improve on Shakespeare? "I like the rhythm of it," I said. "The rhythm of it?" "Yes." Mrs. Baker considered this for a moment. Then she nodded. "So do I," she said, and turned back to spreading the red plague. That had been close, but I watched her with something like amazement. She had known the curses, both of them. She had read the play, and she had still let me read it. Whatever she was plotting, it was a whole lot more devious than I had given her credit for. I decided to ease into things more naturally, to let Caliban curses come where they might fit in without any fuss.
Okay, so what I wrote down for notes is well, let's just review really quick. So Holly Hood comes into school really early, and they are setting up the trap up in the ceiling. And then he goes into the classroom with Mrs. Baker. And, you know, he's whispering all of these Shakespeare lines that would be rude, I would say, in modern day. And if you translate them. So my note was, do you think she was impressed? Do you think she was impressed that he studied these so well and was literally kept saying them over and over again? That's what I would like to know. And when she says, you know, that she likes the rhythm of it too, do you think that he's finally seeing like they have more in common than what he thought? I wonder. I'm going to stop this video and I'm going to make another one because now it's up to 16 minutes. Right now would be a great time if you want to stretch or, you know, walk around or something, and then come back and we'll finish the book. Okay.